there are a few important concepts in the background here. I don't want to go into great detail about these, but you'll notice early that Fanon talks about the other, capital O. This is a concept that is borrowed from Jean-Paul Sartre. And there's a kind of assumption that when we are thinking and acting, we're thinking and acting in a social context. We don't think and act completely as individuals. We're aware of others. We're aware of their perceptions of us. And in a way, we need each other. There's a kind of image or a kind of dream, particularly in American society, I think, of like a world where I don't need anybody else. I don't need any other humans. I'm perfectly independent. But if you think about what that would really be like what would life really be like if it was just you and not anybody else? It would be extremely lonely. You probably would go crazy, right? You'd end up like talking to yourself. If you just had to like live out in the woods or out in the desert or like out in the mountains just by yourself forever, it's barely even a human life. Humans are born for a social life. We're social beings. So by this point in the development of European philosophy, this idea of the other is already accepted and has been analyzed to some extent. So when Fanon's talking about the other, he's talking about an awareness of how he is received by others in social contexts. Another concept that's important here is that of colonialism. So Fanon will refer to this without really explaining what it is. I would just ask you to kind of think historically here. Africa was colonized, parts of Africa were colonized by Europeans who bought pieces of land or took over pieces of land by force, who imposed their rules and laws, who forcibly migrated human beings elsewhere in the world. So there's a kind of colonialism in the Caribbean, for instance, where Black people have been imported by Europeans to the Caribbean and then treated as slaves or second-class citizens. And so colonialism, I mean, what exactly it is, that's not just in Africa, but all over the world. What exactly it is controversial, but to give a very general description, it's any time one group of people that speak one language or have one, culture or civilization or way of doing things, take over some land that is occupied by others, or they maintain their way of living and speaking in a way that basically dictates for some other group of people with another way of living, speaking, another language, another set of practices, another tradition, how things will be. And you can also say colonialism in some form existed in Europe, for instance, when one feudal lord took over large pieces of territory, when the French, took over large pieces of British territory and then imposed French rule on the people whose territory they took over. That's a kind of colonialism. The same kind of thing happened in Africa and in Southeast Asia and all over the world, and has happened at different times in human history. So Fanon is writing in a context where he's very much aware that where he grew up, the French Caribbean, and where he's now working, Algeria, are colonial societies. They're societies where there are basically two groups of people, colonizers and the colonized. People who are in charge and get to dictate what the laws are, and people who are not in charge and whose ways of doing things are always treated as not as important or not as legitimate as those of the colonizers. And I would invite you at this point just to ask yourself to what extent do you think, based on that basic description of colonialism, to what extent do you think the United States is a colonial society? To what extent has it been in the past? To what extent is it now? Are we still a colonial society? Is it a colonial society? Think about that. I mean, is there not a way of life that has been imposed by people who took land and that continues to be treated as the acceptable or official way of doing things at the expense of the ways of doing things of people who are who are treated as less than or as second-class citizens, a kind of colonized. So you think about it. I mean, there are a lot of ways of answering the question, and then we'll move on. Another thing to notice here is that there are a number of quotations throughout the chapter, that is, statements in quotation marks. These are often giving a kind of sample of racist statements. They're giving a sample of ways that the black-white racial dynamic manifests itself in specific patterns of thought. And I would say what Fanon is doing here is he's giving a kind of partial map of the total racist complex through these specific instances of racism. He wants the reader to experience with him the kind of total oppression that comes about from constantly hearing the same dynamic manifested in so many different ways. So I'll give you some examples. The chapter starts out with, "Look, a Negro." That's one quotation from the beginning. Or, "Look, a Negro, Mama, look, a Negro, I'm scared." And then later he has, "You see, my dear friend, color prejudice is totally foreign to me. But do come in, old chap. You won't find any color prejudice here. Quite so. The black is just as much a man as we are. It's not because he's black that he's less intelligent than we are. I had a Senegalese colleague in the regiment, very smart guy." So in all of these expressions, even the ones that are apparently not racist, because they're saying, "I'm not a racist, I don't believe black people are inferior," there's still the reference to the system of analysis, the racist system, the one that says, "Oh, black people are stupid." Like there's the implicit reference is to that idea. And so what Fanon is trying to do is just trying to help us to feel the oppressiveness of constantly being reminded of that idea as he is throughout his life, even by people who tell him, "I'm not a racist." What they're saying, in saying what they're saying, they're reminding him of the dynamic. They're not meaning to, but it's in a way it's to prove that the dynamic exists and that it is oppressive. So when you see those quotations, you can think of them as a kind of survey of different ways that this racist pattern of interpretation manifests itself. And the last point I want to make before we dive into the text itself, it might be kind of obvious, but I just want to be clear about this. Fanon is not an essentialist about race. Fanon does not believe that black people are essentially a particular way or white people are essentially. He doesn't think that you can legitimately, he doesn't think that black people have a nature which is a certain way and white people have a nature which is a certain way. In fact, that's a foundational piece of the whole racist edifice. He wants as much as possible to get completely beyond that idea. But he is going to describe things in terms of the white says this, the black says this. It's a shorthand for, again, analyzing the dynamics. So even when he says those things, just remember that he's not being an essentialist about race itself. He is trying to analyze the way that this thought complex and this experience complex of the pathological white-black racial dynamics manifests.